So how do we set up a test of hypothesis? Well, we need four very important pieces of information, and these are four pieces of information which are usually provided, but sometimes not clearly, sometimes not explicitly, sometimes you have to go look for them, and sometimes you have to read between the lines to figure out what they are. So first of all, we have to figure out again what is the population or populations of interest. Sometimes we're actually comparing two populations. So we have to clearly identify what they are. We have to be very clear on identifying whom do we want to include, whom do we don't want to include, what is the target population or populations, how is it different from the available one, and so on and so on. The second thing we need to identify is what are the variables. What are we looking at? What kind of information about the population do we want to collect and analyze? That is very, very important, but again, quite often it's not really clearly identified. The third thing is the parameters. Remember, I hope you still remember from what we've done in the past, that the parameters are basically some numerical summaries of the whole population. So what numerical summaries are we interested in? The mean, mu, and the standard deviation, SD, are only two of the most common parameters that are used, but we'll see that there are others that are used as well. And the last thing is, what question do we have about these parameters? What do we want to know? We may ask, for instance, is it true that the mean is not equal to 5? Or is it true that the standard deviation is greater than 2? Notice, however, is one of the important things that we're going to figure out later is that what we're going to be testing is always something that has to do with an inequality. So either a true inequality like the mean is not equal to 5, or a limited inequality of the form a standard deviation is greater than something like 2. Okay, so in every situation we're going to have to identify those four pieces of information: the populations, the variables, the parameters, and numerical question of interest about those parameters. Let me give you a basic example just to see how these things apply. You may remember that on the first day of class we did some either jumping jacks or knee bends. Okay, and the question is, well, is it true that jumping jacks are more strenuous than knee bends? Well, seems reasonable to assume so. Even if you have done jumping jacks and knee bends, you know that jumping jacks tend to be, make you puff and punt a little bit more than knee bends. Okay, but hey, we are a scientific community, so we want to analyze this stuff in a very scientific way. We just don't want to rely just on our impressions. Okay, so we're going to have to go through the four steps first of all to identify the important things, and then we can proceed with our hypothesis test. Okay, so what is the population? Well, in our case, we decided our population of interest was nursing students. So is it true that jumping jacks are more strenuous than knee bends for nursing students? We could have chosen something else, whatever the population of interest to us is, but let's focus on that one. That's what we used in class. That's what we're continuing to use. Well, what variable are we looking at? Good question. What do we mean by more strenuous? How are we going to measure that? Are we going to measure it by asking people how tired they feel? Are we going to measure what is the frequency of their respiration? Are we going to measure, what are we going to measure? Well, the one thing that we did measure in class, if you remember, was the heart rate after the exercise. So we're going to use that one. Remember, this is another choice. We identified this particular variable. We could have used other variables to measure the level of how strenuous. Oh, what's the right word for that? The strenuity? I don't know. Anyway, the level of at which you feel tired. Okay, so we're going to use the heart rate after exercise to measure that. Next thing is, what do we want to know about this heart rate? Okay, how are we going to compare the heart rates after exercise and the jumping jacks and the knee bends? Again, there are several ways of doing it. We're going to choose to look at mean heart rates. Okay, so we're going to check if the mean heart rate for people who did jumping jacks was in fact higher than the mean heart rate for the people who did knee bends. We could have chosen something else. We could have chosen the median. We could have chosen some different kind of average. Okay, but we have to make a choice. Let's pick the mean for now. What is the numerical question that interests us? What about the mean? I just mentioned it, but just to write it very explicitly so we can all see it, the question is it true that the mean heart rate for people who do jumping jacks is actually greater than the mean heart rate for people who do knee bends? Okay? So those are the four things that we will need to identify every time we're trying to analyze a hypothesis test.